Okay, welcome back to all of you guys. I'm going to start this next topic of God's creative action. You have free will. This is going to help you to learn how to either have a relationship with God and get to enlightenment, or to not have a relationship with God and still get to enlightenment. There's things to be able to teach you on both sides of this. And depending on what you've been taught in the past, you're going to hear some things that are maybe very different than what you've been exposed to before. If you've been taught to fear God, or if you've been taught that God punishes people and rewards people, or if you've been taught that you need to worship this being, or if you've been taught that you need to pray to this being and ask for this being to do all kinds of things for you, you're going to see in a way that you can independently verify that these things aren't actually true. So I'm going to be teaching you about this being of God, but then I'm also going to teach you how to get to enlightenment without a relationship with this being, because it's basically like your next door neighbor at your neighborhood. If you have a relationship with your next door neighbor, it's wonderful. When you need something, when you need to talk with somebody, or when you see them out in their yard, it's like, hey, neighbor, how are you? Nice to see you, right? It's nice to have a relationship with your neighbor, and it helps you to maybe get through life. If you need to borrow some sugar or some salt or something like that, you have a neighbor to go borrow that from. But if you didn't have a relationship with your neighbor, you can still get through life just fine too without it. And that's why here with the teachings of the Buddha, you can get to enlightenment with a relationship with God or without a relationship with God. The Buddha doesn't put God at the center of his teachings, because it's not God that determines whether you get to enlightenment or not. It's you that determines that. So he puts you at the center of his teachings. So I'm going to teach you this topic to be able to help you to either have a relationship with God or not have a relationship with God. And you can ask any and all questions that you like as we go. Okay? So first, just to get us started, I'm going to share some definitions with you here to be able to help you understand what I'm talking about. You may or may not think about this being in the same way as me, but this is how I'm talking about this being, so at least you'll know what I'm talking about. So I describe this being God as the creator of the universe and source of all moral authority, the supreme being. This being is referred to as God in the English language typically, but there's other ways to refer to this being too. Some people refer to this being as Allah, or the all-knowing and all-powerful, or this is omniscience and omnipotent. During the lifetime of the Buddha, they refer to this being as the great Brahma. You'll see this in his teachings. Some people think that the Buddha didn't teach about God, but he actually did. For anybody who says that the Buddha didn't teach about God, or he rejected God, or he denied the existence of God, they haven't actually studied his original teachings, because he talks about God in his teachings. He just doesn't make him a central role. So when we use the word God, they used great Brahma during the lifetime of the Buddha. And other people might use the word Allah or some other words like this. So here, what I'm referring to as moral conduct, or this authority on all moral conduct, is maintaining and acting upon higher principles for proper conduct. It's important to understand that we have free will. Sometimes people think that this being God is controlling you, or that this being has a plan for you and you need to fulfill that plan, you need to live up to that plan. This isn't actually true. You have free will. And if you don't know this to be true, that you have free will, you need to ask yourself, who chose the hairstyle that you currently have? Who chose those clothes that you're wearing? Who chose where you're sitting right now? Who chose where you live? Who chose the breakfast that you ate this morning? These are all choices that you're making. There's nobody that's forcing you to make these choices, because you have free will. So you need to be able to see that this being isn't controlling you. This being doesn't have a plan for you that you need to live up to. You have free will to make all your own choices that you'd like to make. God doesn't grant enlightenment, as I shared. It's a practitioner's own decisions that actually lead you to whether you attain enlightenment or not. And this is the reason why you can either choose to have a relationship with this being or not, because it's not this being who decides whether you attain enlightenment or not. So as I'm talking throughout our discourse today and this conversation about this being God, you might hear me refer to this being using the pronoun he, because whenever I've interacted with this being, I feel that this being is of a male gender. You may or may not think about this being in that same way. You might think of this being as a female or a non-gender, or however you would like to think of this being. But every once in a while, you might hear me refer to this being using the pronoun he, and just understand that that's the way that I think whenever I interact with this being. But how you choose to think about this being is up to you. But just so you'll know that you'll hear me probably say that every once in a while. Okay? So what I'll share with you about God in terms of Gotama Buddha's teachings, that at least get you introduced to this, is that the Buddha never denied the existence of God. He taught people how to attain enlightenment while having an understanding of this being, because people did have understanding or belief, at least, in this being during his lifetime. So the Buddha did teach about this being. As I mentioned, some people will tell you that the Buddha rejected God, or some people will tell you that he denied the existence of God. This isn't true. I can show you discourse after discourse after discourse from the original teachings where the Buddha actually teaches about God. I'm going to show you one of them today, but you can see it in the book series that I have here where the Buddha talks about this being of God. The Buddha discusses various gods in his teachings. He actually doesn't talk about just one God. He talks about many gods, because during the lifetime of the Buddha, people had belief in many gods. But typically when he was teaching, he would talk about this one God, this great God of Brahma, this great Brahma. But then he would talk about these other gods too, because people believed in these other gods. Gotama Buddha's objective wasn't to prove or disprove God's existence, because the way a Buddha teaches is they teach in a way that you can independently verify whatever it is that they're teaching. And the Buddha didn't have any independently verifiable evidence to either prove God's existence or disprove his existence. So that wasn't his actual goal. The Buddha's goal was to teach you how to get to enlightenment, how to liberate the mind, get freedom from those strong feelings so that you can experience peace and joy always in your life. That was his ultimate goal. So he wasn't trying to prove or disprove God's existence. It wasn't until later, about 500 years after the death of the Buddha, that Jesus comes along, performs a whole bunch of miracles in order to convince people who he was, in order to convince people that there was only one God. Because up to that point, the vast majority of the world thought there were multiple gods, and it was Jesus's objective to be able to help people to see that there's only one God. So that didn't come until about 500 years after the death of the Buddha. But the Buddha, his goal wasn't to either prove or disprove God's existence, but to help you understand the teachings that you need in order to get to enlightenment and liberate the mind. So the Buddha focused practitioners on acquiring wisdom and being able to see the truth and getting to this enlightened mental state through based in right view and understanding those Four Noble Truths and having an understanding of the natural law of karma, not God's creative activity or God's creative actions. Okay, so here's a discourse from the Buddha where he's talking about free will and essentially ensuring that people understood that you have free will. Here, the Buddha is coming in contact with some other ascetics, some other people who are working on the path to enlightenment. You might think that during the lifetime of a Buddha, he's the only one teaching, because if there was a Buddha alive during your lifetime, you'd probably like to study with that person. You'd like to find that person and study with that person. But there's no outward characteristic that determines someone is or isn't a Buddha. So it's not like their ears turned a certain way or they have a certain mole for everybody to know that this person's a Buddha. So some people knew that the Buddha was a Buddha and they studied with him, but there were other teachers who were claiming that it was their teachings that led to enlightenment, and people were studying with those people. And the Buddha would sometimes come in contact with these kinds of people. They would kind of like sit down and eat together. And here's a discourse where the Buddha is talking to some of his students, explaining one of these situations. This one is titled, "All is Caused by God's Creative Action." Then, monks, I approach those ascetics and Brahmins who hold such a doctrine in view as this: whatever this person experiences, whether pleasure, pain, or neither pain nor pleasure, all that is caused by God's creative activity. And I said to them, is it true that you venerable ones hold such a doctrine in view? So essentially, he basically approached these people. Usually they sat down to eat together, and he asked them, is it true that you think that everything you experience, whether pleasure, pain, or neither pain nor pleasure, that all of that is caused by God's actions? Because of God, you're experiencing the pleasure, the pain, or neither pain nor pleasure. So the Buddha asked these people this. When I asked them this, they affirm it, meaning they said, yeah, that's exactly the case, that whatever we experience, it's because of God. Then I said to them, in such a case, is it due to God's creative activity that you might destroy life, take what is not given, indulge in sexual activity, speak falsehood, produce argumentative speech, speak harshly, indulge in idle chatter, that you might be full of longing, have a mind of ill will, and hold wrong view. So he's saying, well, if God's the one who's producing all the pleasure, the pain, and the neither pain nor pleasure, is it God that's forcing you to do all these things, to kill, to steal, to have sexual misconduct, to speak with lies, to have argumentative speech, speak harshly, indulge in idle chatter like frivolous speech, unbeneficial and unpurposeful speech, that your mind is full of craving, desire, attachment, that your mind has ill will, anger, hatred, and ill will, and you have wrong view, meaning you have a lack of wisdom. That's the craving, anger, and ignorance. Is it because of God that you have all of those? And then he says, those who fall back on God's creative activity as an essential truth have no interest to do what should be done and to avoid doing what should not be done, nor do they make an effort in this respect. So what he's saying is that if you think God's the one who's causing all of these things, you're not even trying to improve your life, because how could you? If you thought that God was the one who was creating everything in your life, that means you're locked in. You're a robot. You can't do anything to improve your life. So the Buddha is saying that if you fall back on that it's God that's causing all these things in your life, then you're not even trying to avoid what should not be done, and you're not even making an effort to do the wise things that should be done. Since they do not apprehend as true and valid anything that should be done or should not be done, they are muddle-minded. They do not guard themselves, and even the personal designation of aesthetic could not be legitimately applied to them. So what he's saying is, if you have such a lack of wisdom that you think God is the one who's causing everything that you experience, then your mind is muddled, meaning that you have a lack of concentration. Because when you have pollution in your mind, those 10 fetters, you're going to lack concentration, you're going to lack focus. But when you purify your mind will be focused, it'll be performing optimally. So he would oftentimes refer to people who haven't trained their mind as muddle-minded because they're lacking concentration. And he says they do not guard themselves. What he's saying is they're not guarding their mind with mindfulness or awareness of mind. Whenever the Buddha talks about a guard, that's what he's talking about is mindfulness, that you need to guard your mind with mindfulness so that when you see the discontent feelings arising, you cut it off and let it go. And that's what's going to essentially retrain your mind to no longer experience those conditioned feelings. Your mindfulness is like a virus scanner that's kind of looking over your mind. And then whenever there's any discontentedness, your mind steps into action and applies right effort to cut it off and let it go. Just like a virus scanner is sitting there watching your hard drive, and then whenever any kind of virus comes onto your hard drive, it quarantines it and then cleans it up and gets it off your hard drive. The same thing needs to occur within your mind, that you have this mindfulness overlooking your mind, and whenever you see an unwholesome thought come up, you need to cut that off and let it go. If you allow your mind to have that unwholesome thought and that persists in the mind, then your mind just stays wired to have these unwholesome thoughts over and over and over again. So if you're having thoughts about the past or the future or in the present moment about any kind of unwholesome things, you'd like to cut that off and let it go and essentially break that up and don't allow your mind to stay wired that way. That's what he's talking about when he's saying a guard, that you need to guard the mind with your mindfulness. He's saying they don't guard themselves. And even the personal designation aesthetic could not be legitimately applied to them. What an aesthetic is someone who's given up worldly life and gone into this life of homelessness in order to be able to attain enlightenment. They're on the path to enlightenment. So what the Buddha is saying is, if you fall back on it's God that all these things are occurring in your life, then you're not even on the path to enlightenment. You haven't even been able to see the first truth, that it's your decisions that lead to any particular results in your life. And if you can't see that essential truth, then you're not even on the path to enlightenment, is what he's essentially saying. Like, you can't even legitimately be called an ascetic or someone who's on the path to enlightenment. So here, what he's essentially getting to is that you have free will. That what it is that you experience in your day-to-day life, it isn't caused by God. And if you've been taught that, you're going to need to be able to see the truth, because that's just a belief that people have, that they believe that God is controlling them, or they believe that God is punishing them or rewarding them. But you need to look at your own life, that if you see your food in front of you, sometimes people pray over their food and they thank God for the food that they have. God didn't give you that food. That was your decisions that led to that food. It wasn't God that gave you that. There were certain decisions that you made that led to you being able to get that food. It wasn't God that gave it to you. So if you continue to think that it's God that's providing you all these things, then you're not cultivating the wisdom that you need to make wise decisions that lead to wholesome results in your life. And that's what you would need to ultimately get to in order to fully awake to enlightenment, is to be able to see this cause and effect, or this action and result. And if you think that it's because of this being of God that you're experiencing any particular thing in life, you're not able to see this cause and effect. Therefore, you're not cultivating the wisdom to make wise decisions that lead to wholesome results in your life, or wholesome karma. So this is one discourse where the Buddha is talking about God, but he talks about God in plenty of other discourses. So anytime you ever see someone that says the Buddha denied the existence of God or rejected God, you can see that that's not true, because here's the Pali Canon, in a place that you can go back and reference. Using this reference, you can see the Buddha indeed talks about God at different times. Okay, these are some teachings from the Buddha where he's declaring them as undeclared teachings, because these things are oftentimes taught in places where we learn about God, that there's certain things that you might have been taught that aren't necessarily true. So at different times during the life of the Buddha, he gave a discourse when he said, these are my undeclared teachings. He says, remember, students, this is what I taught. And he describes the Four Noble Truths. And then he says, remember what I did not teach. I did not teach these things. And he gives these 10 things. He doesn't teach whether the world is eternal or whether the world is not eternal. He didn't teach whether the world is finite or infinite. He didn't teach whether the soul is the same as the body, or the soul is one thing and the body is another. He actually didn't teach about a soul at all. This is an undeclared teaching. He doesn't teach after death the Tathagata exists. After death, the Tathagata does not exist. After death, the Tathagata both exists and does not exist. After death, the Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist. What the Tathagata is the Buddha. This is how he would refer to himself. He very rarely referred to himself as a Buddha, because a Buddha doesn't need to go around and convince people that they're an actual Buddha. So he would refer to himself as the Tathagata. What this means is the one who speaks the truth, or the one who discovered the truth, or the one who shares the truth. So that's what the word Tathagata means. And he was an enlightened being. So what he's basically saying is, I'm not declaring whether an enlightened being exists after death, whether enlightened beings do not exist after death, whether they both exist and do not exist, or whether they neither exist nor do not exist. Because sometimes what you're going to hear is people say, when you get to enlightenment, you don't exist anymore. This isn't actually true. The Buddha didn't declare that. You're no longer in the cycle of rebirth, but whether there's something else after enlightenment, the Buddha never declared that. So basically, he left it as an undeclared teaching. And by the time you get to enlightenment, your mind is so peaceful and so joyful, it doesn't matter whether there's something next. The teachings of the Buddha aren't about believing a bunch of things and then hoping something good happens when you die. The teachings of the Buddha are, let's get to peace and joy now in this life. That if your mind is longing, yearning for this pleasant afterlife after this, now you can't get to enlightenment. You're stuck. You're kind of like in this endless loop. Because you're longing, yearning for this wonderful afterlife, you can never find out what is next, because your mind is still longing, yearning. You're still having craving. You're still stuck in the cycle of rebirth. But when you can get rid of all your cravings, desires, attachments, you can get to liberation and to peace in this life. So the Buddha wisely didn't teach what is or isn't next. He just left it as an undeclared teaching. And you need to get to the point where in the present moment, your mind isn't longing, yearning for something next, and you can just be peaceful and joyful in the present moment. So he doesn't declare what is or isn't next. And if you ever encounter something where someone teaches you that the Buddha teaches you're going to be in heaven, or you're going to not exist, or anything like this, you can see that the Buddha didn't teach this. And you can go back to the original Pali Canon and see where this is. And I have it in all the book series, so you can see exactly where this is, and that the Buddha didn't teach any of these things. Okay, so now with that understanding, I'm going to share with you how to have a relationship with God if you would like, but just understand that a relationship with God is not required, but having a relationship with God won't hinder you on the path to enlightenment either, if you're learning and practicing in the way that I'm going to share with you. Because if you've been taught certain things about God, those things could potentially hinder you from having this wonderful relationship, and it can also hinder you from getting to enlightenment as well. So what I'm going to do is teach you a way to have a relationship with this being and still get to enlightenment. And then I'm going to teach you how to get to enlightenment without a relationship with this being too. So if you'd like to have a relationship with this being and get to enlightenment, you need to understand and practice right view. Right view is that any discontent feelings that you're experiencing is coming from your own mind. You need to be able to independently verify this through the Four Noble Truths, that it's craving, desire, attachment that's causing your pleasure, your pain, and your neither pain nor pleasure. And essentially the underlying meaning of the Four Noble Truths is you need to accept responsibility and accountability for everything that's happening in your life. As long as you blame other people for what you're experiencing, you're never going to experience any improvement, because you're not cultivating wisdom to improve your life. So if you have unfortunate things that are happening in your life and you just blame other people, then you're never cultivating the wisdom to see what decisions did I make that led to this particular thing. So therefore, you're going to just keep making those unwise decisions and keep experiencing those unfortunate things. So if you think that God is the one who's causing you to experience what it is that you're experiencing, then you're never going to be able to have a wonderful relationship with this being, because every time that something unfortunate happens in your life, you might blame it on this being, that it's this being that's causing you to experience these things. But you need to be able to see more and more that it's coming from your decisions. It's not coming from other people, not just this being of God, but other people sometimes get blamed too in the unenlightened state, that you might blame others for what it is that you're experiencing. So get to the point where you understand right view, which is your mind is causing your own discontentedness based in craving, desire, attachment. And anything you experience, either wholesome or unwholesome, is coming from your decisions. This is the funny thing about the ego, since we talked about the ego yesterday, is that when you're experiencing fortunate things, like wholesome things in your life, you might be all too ready to take credit for that. But then when we experience unwholesome things, we blame other people. So we can't have it two ways. It can't be that all these wholesome things that happen in my life, it's because of me and my decisions. But these unwholesome things that happen, that's not because of me. That's because of somebody else, right? It's either one way or the other. You got to decide. And if you see the truth for yourself, everything you experience is because of your decisions. And the beauty in understanding this is, if there's anything that you don't particularly care for about what's going on in your life, you just cultivate wisdom, make different decisions, and you will experience different results. But if it's everybody else, including God, that's causing the things that are happening in your life, you're stuck. You're locked in. You can't do anything at all about it. You can't change anything. So in order to get to liberation and to enlightenment and to a healthy relationship with this being, you're going to need to be able to see that whatever you experience in life is coming from your decisions. It's not good luck. It's not bad luck. It's not destiny. It's not fate. It's none of those things. It's basically decisions that you're making. Either wisely or unwisely, you're experiencing either wholesome or unwholesome results. Okay. Then next, you're going to need to eliminate any potential craving in the mind, any attachment to this being of God. Because oftentimes people, when they learn about this being, they oftentimes get attached to this being. So if you've been taught to crave things from this being of God, like maybe you sit down in prayer and you beg and you plead this being to give things to you, right? Like, please give me a bigger house. Please give me a better job. Please help me find a boyfriend or girlfriend. Please give me nicer clothes, nicer food, right? You might be asking this being for all these things in your life. This is the mind lacking wisdom and thinking that God is a genie in a bottle and it's just going to poof. And now you're going to magically get the things that you're asking for. So if you've been doing this, then you can see that this isn't true. And we can actually test it right here, right? We can all put our hands together and we could pray and we can say, God, please, please, please give us $1 million so we can help the Thai people and we can give them food and give them clothing. Please, 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 please give us more money. And has it shown up yet? right? And we can see, no, it doesn't show up because God's not a genie in a bottle. Anything that we experience is a result of our decisions. If we would like to have $1 million to give away to the poor people that are experiencing famine and lacking resources, we're going to have to go out and get that money. God's not going to just give it to us in order to give it to those people. So if you've been taught that God is a genie in a bottle and you've been praying for things, this is based on your own craving, desire, attachments. And the unfortunate thing about this is sometimes people do this, they don't get what they want, and then they get angry at God because their craving isn't fulfilled. So if your mom's in the hospital, and you pray and beg and plead for God to heal mom. And please, God, don't let her die. Please, 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 please. And now when she dies, you think that it's because of God. And now somebody gets angry because of God. They think that their anger is from God. And now they might push God aside. This is the aversion. And this is where people have gotten really far away from this relationship, right? Because if you really want this thing and you get it, you'll feel happy. But if you don't get it, you'll get angry and sad. And then oftentimes people associate those painful feelings with something external, like God. And then maybe they might push this being away. This is aversion, right? So if you're choosing to do this now where you're praying and you're pleading with this being like a genie in a bottle, asking for your wishes to be fulfilled, you're going to need to eliminate that, where you understand that anything you experience is coming from your decisions. You're going to need to eliminate that craving, that longing, yearning for this being to provide you any particular thing. If you would like to pray, you might let this being know that you either believe in him or you know that he exists, whatever it is that you would like to say. Let them know that you're open to guidance and give thanks, because this being actually can give you guidance on the path to enlightenment. This being can help you along the path. It's not going to be he's not going to be at your beck and call, where as soon as you're like, please tell me, what should I do? Should I do this or should I do that? He's not going to do that. But if you let this being know that you're open to their guidance at different times in your life, this being can actually give you some insight and wisdom about the path to enlightenment. But you're going to need to still learn and practice and decide what is the truth, because there's other beings out there that are interested in causing calamity, and they might be giving you influence and giving you thoughts too. And you need to decide, what is it that you're going to do, either wise or unwise? So this being God can actually guide you along the path and help you along the path if you're open to this being's guidance. But they're not going to just push their way into your life and start telling you what you should or shouldn't do. They're going to give you some guidance through having thoughts in your mind, and you'll be able to then look at that, learn that, reflect on it to see whether it's true, practice it to be able to see whether it's true, and then you'll be able to be thankful that this being has guided you through certain parts of the path. So that's a way that you could pray if you would like to pray, is give thanks. You can let this being know that you're open to their guidance, and let them know that you're interested in a relationship with this being. So you're going to need to eliminate any craving to be with God in heaven. If you've been taught that the goal is to please this being all through your life, to praise this being, to worship this being, and then this being is going to have favoritism towards you, and now this being is going to bring you to heaven, and now you're going to be in heaven for the rest of eternity with this being, this isn't true. The heavenly realm isn't permanent, that you're not going to go to heaven and be with God permanently. It's just not the way that this life works, that it's not about that. And if you've been taught that, you might have a craving to be with this being in heaven. And you're going to need to understand that that's an attachment, that's a longing, yearning, and you're not going to be able to get to enlightenment that way. So if there's any kind of attachment to God whatsoever, any kind of craving or longing and yearning, you're going to need to eliminate that and understand that this being is this being, and it's going to do whatever it would like to do. Don't put expectations on this being, wanting things from this being, longing and yearning for things from this being. You're going to need to let go of any attachment to this being. Okay? So this is the first part. Then you're going to need to understand the natural law of karma, that anything you experience in life is from your decisions. It's this cause and effect, or this action and result. It's not God that's determining what does happen or doesn't happen in this world. It's our decisions, right? So if there's a murder or a rape in the world, it's not God that has caused that. It's our decisions that have led to that. And God's not going to stop that. that his role isn't to restrain us from ourselves, right? If you had a child and you had a child that was constantly going over to the stove and kept trying to touch the stove, probably initially you would try to restrain the child and try to stop the child from touching the stove, but this child's going to keep trying to go to the stove and touch the stove. This is what my son did. And after I tried to stop him 3, 4, 5, 6 times from touching the stove, eventually I just let him get close to the stove. And I just sat there and watched him. And he walked over to the stove, he felt the heat, and then he took his hand away and he never touched the stove after that, right? So you need to cultivate wisdom. That's the way that you learn things. Whereas if every time we tried to do something that was unwise, if God kept restraining us from that, we would never cultivate the wisdom that we need in order to make wiser and wiser decisions. We would be controlled by this being. And none of us would be interested in living in a world where another being was controlling us. We would absolutely despise that. So the idea that God should stop murders or stop rapes or stop famine or things like this, it's just unwise for somebody to do that. That if this particular being restrained us every single time that we were headed for calamity, we would never cultivate the wisdom that we need in order to make wise decisions in the world. So we need to be able to see that it's our decisions that are leading to any particular result that we experience in life, not God. Sometimes people have been taught to fear God, that somehow they should fear this being because they've been taught that God is punishing us and rewarding us and that we should go around with fear in our mind. Well, if you fear an individual that you're in a relationship with, how could you ever cultivate a healthy relationship? If you lived with somebody like a life partner or a roommate, and every time you came home, you had fear and you were like tiptoeing around the house and you were afraid of this person, how could you ever have a healthy relationship with this individual that you're living with? You would always be constantly looking over your shoulder. You would constantly be unsettled. So if you have fear and you've been taught to fear this being, there's nothing to fear. This being isn't causing you any kind of difficulties or any kind of struggles. There's nothing that fearing this being is going to help you with. So you would like to get to the point where you don't have fear of this being and you realize that this being isn't the one who's causing any kind of difficulties or struggles in your life. So if you've been taught to fear this being, you're going to need to be able to see how that's unhealthy and it's not going to promote a healthy relationship with this being. And you're going to need to eliminate that. So what you might come to is like, okay, well, if God's not controlling us and God's not forcing us to do things, and I'm not supposed to worship God and praise God, and that's not something that is going to necessarily lead to any wholesome results, and I'm not fearing God, then what's the real purpose? What's the real purpose? Well, if you'd like an understanding of God, you might think about God as a practitioner of these teachings, that God's the one who essentially created these natural laws, and God is an enlightened being. God understands these teachings inside and out, backwards and forwards, but he's not attached to us. He's not responsible to restrain us. So while he loves us unconditionally, that he's not responsible to restrain us. He's not attached to us. He doesn't want any particular thing for our life. He's interested in seeing all of us get along and all of us be well, but whether we choose to do that or not, it's our decisions. It's not up to God to decide whether we get along or not. It's up to us. So this being is interested in seeing all beings live in harmony. But in order for us to do that, we have to acquire wisdom. By us acquiring wisdom in these natural laws and functioning as a more and more enlightened being, then we can live in harmony together. So it's not this being's decisions that determine whether we live in harmony or not. It's our decisions that determine that. So these is what I have to share with you about this being in terms of how to have a healthy relationship with this being. Do you guys have any questions on anything I've been sharing so far? Yes, ma'am. For those of you guys online, you can put your questions into Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and ask any questions that you like.
Okay, so I have a question about the beginning of the things, about the time of the Buddha. It was 2,500 years ago. So I don't really, like what I know, most of the things about it after that. So I'm interested about the time, like the historical time here, like you said, there was many people that teach. Is it something that like people knew about enlightenment? Like, was it a concept that were in the world? Like, and God, was it like now?
Yeah, so I only know a little bit about that, what they were thinking about at the time. Prior to the Buddha, there was the practice of Hinduism, which some people say has been around for upwards of 5,000 years. And in Hinduism, they have the idea of enlightenment, but I don't know how they would define it or how they would describe it. They're doing things that on the surface can kind of appear a little bit like Buddhist teachings. Now, things have really changed over time, and they're doing things very different than what the Buddha did, but there's certain things that are talked about in this tradition. But what the Buddha did is he brought a level of clarity to these teachings that didn't exist prior to him. So there was meditation going on prior to the Buddha. There was a general understanding of the natural law of Gotama, for example. There was talk of enlightenment and things like this, but people didn't truly understand what it was 100% and with the clarity that the Buddha brought. So that's what he was able to deliver to the world, is bring it in a way that was very clear and obtainable for people. Because a lot of the people that were teaching during his lifetime, they were teaching you to cause harm to the body. And they thought that that was the way to get to enlightenment, that if you could put the body into excruciating pain and your mind could overcome that physical pain, that then you would get to enlightenment. So they were hanging themselves upside down from trees. They were laying on beds of nails. They were piercing their body with metal implements. They were starving themselves. And the Buddha figured out that this isn't going to lead to enlightenment, because he did those things for 2 years and they didn't work. So then the latter 4 years, he figured out how to train his own mind. So over a course of 6 years, he figured out how to get to enlightenment. But his teachings were radically different than what was being taught at the time. So even though there was the concept of enlightenment, there was a little bit of meditation and talking about the natural law of Gotama was being discussed, it wasn't understood the way that the Buddha explained it. And then ultimately people were able to experience enlightenment through his teachings. And that's how they knew what he was teaching was true. And that's why people preserved it for so many years. Because during his lifetime, nothing was written down, but there were so many people that got to enlightenment during his lifetime, and they knew that these were the true teachings, that they ended up documenting them after his death so that more and more people could get to enlightenment. Mm-hmm.
And also the God that he's talking about is the Hindu gods that were here in the area, because the God how we discover in like the West is completely after.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about what they teach in Hinduism. From what I understand, they have 3 different gods, and that's what they teach nowadays. But during the lifetime of the Buddha, when he was teaching about this great Brahma, which we would refer to as God. He calls this being the all-knowing, the all-powerful being, the supreme being, essentially. And that's what we refer to as God. But then he talks about these other gods too. They're kind of like lesser gods. He talks about like 33 gods or 32 gods that people were talking about during that time. But he doesn't really go into a lot of detail about them. Whenever he's really teaching, he's tending to talk about this great Brahma, this all-knowing, all-powerful being that we would refer to as God. So they would refer to this being as Brahma. But nowadays, they have many different ways in Hinduism to talk about gods. They still believe in multiple gods, but it was Jesus that helped us to be able to see that there's just one God. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just have a question about this. How wise decisions can lead to a wholesome outcome. And in some cases, I feel like even though you make wise decisions or not unwise decision, then things that are not wholesome still happens. Like, for example, the example before with a girl who's taking a walk during daytime and someone rapes her, and it's not like she made a bad decision by taking a walk during the day, and then still this happens. And And I also had like several incidents like this week, more like not anything luckily that like this, but more like daily life stuff where you feel like I didn't really do anything wrong in that way, or I was, being kind and like not doing anything, and then you have an experience with someone who treats you like really, where you're like, wow, where did that come from? And so yeah, my mind is struggling a little to figure out how that goes together.
Sure. So until someone's enlightened, they're going to be experiencing unwholesome results. And it's not just from what you're doing at that particular moment. It's a sequence of events. So if you're in a situation where someone's being disrespectful and rude, you're going to even experience that as an enlightened being. Every once in a while, there's going to be people who are impolite, unkind, unfriendly, and disrespectful. That's just impermanence. That's all that is. When your mind became disappointed or frustrated or whatever it was that you experienced, that was because of your craving, your longing, yearning, and wanting this person to be a certain way. And you're wanting this permanence of people to be polite, kind, friendly, respectful with you. Everybody, even as an enlightened being, you're still going to experience people being disrespectful occasionally. It'll be very rare and few and far between, but it will happen. But your mind at that point will be fully protected. So whenever you're looking at the natural law of karma, it's not just, what was I doing in that moment? Yes, you need to look at that and see that, but it's a sequence of events that is leading to any particular situation. So if somebody is in a neighborhood that is known for rapes, or if somebody goes to a country that is known for rapes, these are decisions that are leading you closer and closer to that experience, where it's very unlikely in a place like this that you would experience something like that, because you're among a group of people that have very little craving, anger, and ignorance in their mind. And by living in a place like this, you're less likely to experience something like that. So the decisions that we make, it's not just that I'm walking down the street. It's that I made a decision to go to this particular country, to this particular neighborhood, to this particular places. And yeah, I was just walking down the street, not causing any harm, but there was this sequence of events that led to that particular situation. And it's only once your mind is fully enlightened that you won't be experiencing any unwholesome results at all. But the unwholesome results are like your mind being discontent. That's part of your unwholesome results, because the mind still has pollutions. So it doesn't mean that when you're enlightened that you're going to walk around the world and people are going to bow down to you, and you're never going to hear anybody be disgruntled or bitter or harsh, because that's not the way it is. It's just that your mind is trained so well, and that you are functioning in such a way that the people around you, by and large, are going to be polite, kind, friendly, and respectful, because you've been functioning that way for so long. But every once in a while, there's going to be someone who's disrespectful and unkind, but your mind won't be discontent at that point. Your mind's fully protected.
And then I have another question about what you talked about before, like this praying or like manifesting, for example, is something that's very like in and very popular, and everyone is talking about manifestation. And what is your take on that?
Basically, what people are doing is they're taking from the past, where people would pray to God and ask God to give them something, and then they realize like, this isn't working, where now manifestation is essentially the next thing. They've just taken God out of it, and they just think that they can sit down, visualize something, and poof, it's going to happen. There's no such thing as the law of attraction. There's no such thing as manifesting something. There's, you make wise decisions and you will experience the results of that, which will be wholesome. And if you make unwise decisions, you will experience the results of that, which will be unwholesome. There's no ability to sit down and just poof and manifest something in your life. If somebody thinks they're going to sit down and think about their soulmate and all the different qualities this person is going to have, and then poof, in the next couple of weeks that they're going to appear in front of them, this isn't the way it works. That you need to be a polite, kind, friendly, respectful person. You need to go out into the world, meet people, talk with people, have conversations, spend time with people, get to know people, make a wise decision about who to involve in your life. this is the cause and effect, or cause and effect. Decisions that you're making is leading to any particular result. You can't manifest something like that. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are giving money in these situations to learn these kinds of things. And it's just going to lead them down a path of false beliefs, of unwholesome karma. But that's the choice that those people are making.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
So, I think I understand all of this of free will and God not being attached to us and being not responsible to restrain us. But I still don't know or understand what makes God God.
It's a formless being that is all-knowing, all-powerful. It's a supreme being.
All powerful?
Mm-hmm.
Like he has all the power?
He can do anything that he would like to do, but he doesn't wield that power in the way that an unenlightened being might think he should. Because somebody thinks, well, if he has all the power, shouldn't he stop these murders and stop these rapes? Like, that's what I would do. But that's because your mind is attached and you're wanting the world to be a certain way. This being God doesn't wield that power in the way that somebody thinks that he should. That's their expectation of what he should or shouldn't be doing.
Well, I don't think he should stop any of this. I do believe we are responsible for all of that. But like, is he everywhere?
Yes.
Okay. So is he giving life to everything?
No, it's a cause and effect.
Okay.
That there's a sequence of events that leads to any birth. It's not God that's choosing to bring us into the world or choosing to take us out of the world.
So God, you wouldn't say God is the creator of everything?
Yes, that's the way that the Buddha describes him in his teachings as well. He describes him as the creator. But once that sequence of events has come into being, now he's not dictating what should or shouldn't be happening. He created what we initially started with whenever we started and however it started. And then once that sequence was started, now it's just a matter of cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. The initial cause is God creating what he created. But then from that point forward, it's all the decisions of individual beings and the whole system that is underway through our environment and the sun and the water and all these things. Those are all just happening automatically. It's not God controlling those things.
Is he alive?
He's in existence, and we don't consider him a living being because you need to have the 5 aggregates that be a living being. And this is what we talked about earlier in the week: the physical form, feelings, perceptions, volitional formations, and consciousness. And it's important to understand what a living being is, because in a living being, you can kill a living being, you can harm a living being, but you can't kill and you can't harm a formless being. So that's why, like, hell beings, afflicted spirits, heavenly beings, you can't kill them and you can't harm them. So this being God is a formless being, but we don't really think of this being as being alive, although it is in existence and it has a lifespan that far outweighs anything that we can imagine. It's in a continuous being from the beginning of time until the end of time. But this being isn't really thought of as being alive because it doesn't have the 5 aggregates, but it is in existence.
Can somebody talk to God?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Through, I guess it's
Yeah, we think about, you can talk to God through prayers. You can just talk to God in general. This being is the all-knowing, all-powerful. It knows everything that's going to happen from the beginning of time all the way to the end of time. So this being already knew you were going to ask these questions all the way at the beginning of time. This being has all that wisdom and all that knowledge. So this being knows anything that goes through your mind or anything that's happening. This being already knows those things. So, but if you feel like you would like to talk to this being, you can do it in prayer, but you have to not think about prayer as wanting things and having wishes for this being. You can think of prayer as like having a conversation with this being, but you can also just do this sitting right here. You can just be like, hey God, thank you so much for being part of my life. I really thank you for everything you've ever done to provide wisdom and guidance to help me in this life. You can do that in prayer, or you can just do that in just a regular conversation like you're talking to a friend. This being can hear that and understand that. You don't have to be necessarily on your knees with your hands together, although some people might choose to do it that way. Those batteries are impermanent.
So if God is everywhere, then we are all like a little piece of God?
I don't think of it that way. I think that's the ego and conceit, where people think that they are God or God is within them and these kinds of things. I wouldn't think of it that way, because that puts you in the position of I am a God. Some people even say, I am a God, like we are all gods. No, we're not. We're individual human beings. God doesn't come into the world through the womb of a woman, and that's how all of us came into the world, is through the womb of a woman, and God isn't born that way into the world. So I think it would be the mind's conceit that is thinking that we are God, or we are a God, or we are part of God, or things like this. It's a separate being, separate from all of us. That's everywhere all the time. That's a formless being. I don't suggest you think of yourself as being a piece of God, or that you are a God, or any of these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like difficult for me to understand that God is everywhere, but not in me, or not in you, or in everybody here. Because if he is all over, then why he's not on you?
He's not inside this body. He's here. He's basically all knowing, all powerful. He knows. He's not a formless being, so he's not physically anywhere, but he has wisdom of everything that's going on in the world at any given time. So a formless being can just be anywhere. They're everywhere, but they don't have to be inside your body. Yeah. You okay now? Any more questions? Okay. All right. The things that, you have a question?
Can I just ask one thing? So if you have a free will, do you have a free will to decide if you come here on Earth, like living now as a human being? Is that your decision? You chose to come here, or?
Yes, because if you would have gotten to enlightenment in your last life, there wouldn't have been this life. So you're making choices. Any choices that you make are leading to the particular result that you are experiencing. So by getting to enlightenment in this life and making those choices, then there won't be a next life. So by someone choosing not to get to enlightenment, you're choosing to have a next life. So it's your choices that brought you into this world. It's not God or your parents or anything like that. It's your choices. So that's why, like here in Thailand, like on your birthday or Mother's Day or things like this, Thais really thank their parents for basically going through the sacrifices that allowed them to come into the world. Because now, being in this human world, it's the best opportunity to be able to get to enlightenment. But it is your choices that are leading to that, not other people's choices. So one of the things I was going to share is that when I talk about God, I realize that this may be vastly different than what you've been exposed to before in other parts of your life. And it may be challenging for you to think about some of the things that I'm describing. And that's really helpful. That if what I describe as this being of God is exactly what you're already thinking, then you're not able to see this other way of being. So when somebody's sharing something like this that's very different than what it is that you currently understand, that's really helpful for you to look at it and try to understand it and think about it and reflect on it. And it can sometimes be challenging for the mind to imagine and think about these kinds of things. But the more you think about what I'm sharing with you, you'll be able to see that this is the truth, that this being loves you unconditionally. You don't need to fear this being, and you can't have a healthy relationship as long as you do fear another being, that this being isn't controlling you. It's the natural law of God and your decisions that are leading to any result. You can see that prayer and begging and pleading with this being for certain things isn't going to produce anything in your life. So all these different things that I'm sharing with you, you can get to the point where you can independently verify what I'm sharing. And now that I've shared that, what I'm going to share with you next is, if you have no interest in a relationship with this being God, how you can do that and still get to enlightenment. If you have no interest in a relationship with God, that's fine. You can still learn and grow and develop and actually get to enlightenment, because it's not God's decisions that's going to determine whether you get to enlightenment or not. But there's one thing that you need to be sure that you do in relationship to this being, and that is make sure that you don't have anger, hatred, and ill will towards this being. You're going to need to love and have kindness for all beings. Where some people, if you've had certain experiences in life, you might have anger and hatred towards this being. If you grew up, say, in a church, and maybe the people there were sexually abusing people, maybe even you might have anger and hatred. You might think that those pastors or those ministers, those priests that were doing those unwholesome things, either to you or to other people, you might think that that was God, if you think God is controlling things. And you might be angry, thinking that God's the one who sexually abused you or verbally assaulted you or something like this. You might be thinking this way, and you might have developed anger in your mind towards this being. But more and more, you can see that it's not this being that has done this. So you're going to need to get to the point where maybe you're not interested in a relationship with this being at all, but you need to at least move past any anger or hatred or ill will or frustration or anything like that related to this being. Because whether it's this being or any other being, that if you have anger, hatred, and ill will in your mind, you're not going to be able to get to enlightenment. So even if it's your brother, your sister, your mom or dad, or your ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend that's long in the past and you're never going to see them again, if your mind's still holding on to anger towards that ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend that you're never going to see again, you won't get to enlightenment until you eliminate that anger from your mind. You're going to need to let it go. So the same thing is true about this being, that if you have any anger, hatred, or ill will in your mind at all towards any being whatsoever, including this being, you won't actually be able to get to enlightenment. So you're going to need to completely purify your mind of any anger, hatred, and ill will. So if you have anger, hatred, and ill will in your mind for this being, then you're going to need to include this being in your loving kindness meditation in order to uproot that and eliminate it out of your mind. And then having done so, now you don't hate this being, you don't have anger towards this being, you can just move on with your life and just continue to cultivate wisdom, make wise decisions, and get closer and closer to enlightenment. And you're just not interested in having a relationship with this being, and that's completely fine. And you'll be able to get to enlightenment with no problem. But if you have this anger, you wouldn't be able to actually get to enlightenment as long as this anger is in there for any being whatsoever. Okay, so any questions on this? No? Okay, I'm not seeing any online either. Okay, so this afternoon I'm going to teach you about this meditation to eliminate sexual cravings and the meditation to realize non-self. That's what we're going to do after lunch. So right now is basically 10 minutes to 12. So why don't we just take an extra long lunch, since we've been shortening them up lately? Why don't we go all the way to 1:30? So that way we can have a really nice long lunch, an hour and 40 minutes. If you guys would like to go out and have food, spend time with each other, if you'd like to come back here, take a nap, whatever it is you'd like to do, I'm going to start teaching at 1:30 these two types of meditations, and then we're going to do them together so that you can learn how to not only do them, but you can actually do them and get some practice with them. So if you'd like to take a nice lunch, I'll see you guys at 1:30. Thank you for your questions and the discussion, and I'll maybe see you guys after lunch if you guys would like to come back and learn more. Okay? You're welcome.